The Powers Project.
Carl, it's great to have you here again.
Oh, Kurt, I'm always love being on the Powers Project, and spending time with you is a lot of fun for me.
Well, you truly are. I love all my guests, but you truly are one of my favorite just because of the diversity of topics that we can talk about. And so today, the reason I had you here is because I said, Carl, I want to talk about the 1619 Project, and I want to talk about CRT.
Now, I tell you what, you're setting us up because you had told me that we need to make sure we have some laughter and some lightheartedness, right. And there's no way to do that with a serious topic like the founding of a country and the critical race theory and all those pieces. I'll do my best, though, I promise.
Maybe we can make fun of the people who are on the extremes of these things and
we'll
looking
see.
Ridiculous.
We'll see. It kind of dovetails pretty well with our last discussion about postmodernism, so I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Exactly. Well, so if you would, and like as most people know, I always like to prepare for whatever show I'm having because I like to know what I'm talking about. Because if I don't, then I won't say anything because I don't like looking stupid, and so I'll just be quiet. In this particular case, though, that's what I wanted because I didn't know enough about it, and I didn't want to know. I wanted to learn from you because I know that you know that's one of the reasons why I love having you on the shows because you're a good faith actor, you're honest, and I know that you're going to tell it as it is, regardless.
I'll do my best.
So, well, that's all we can ask. So,
right.
So, tell us about the 1619 Project and what it is exactly, and why there's so much hoopla about it.
Sure, and I'll try to be fair about it from a sense of my own lack of. Obviously was not included, obviously, in that project. So somewhere in, I think, 2018, actually, the New York Times decided to work with, and I believe it was coming from the Times first, and they worked with one of their lead journalists, a lady named Nicole Hannah-Jones. And they produced in 2019, I believe it was in the New York Times Magazine is where it was. My father-in-law, who loves when he sees things about history, always to point them out to me and sometimes ask my opinion, and he's further to the left than from where I usually sit, so he's always kind of interested, not in a provocative way, but just like, what do you think about this? And he sent me a copy of the magazine, actually. And a series of articles were being produced under what loosely was called, it might have been the title of the magazine, actually, but now it's just seemingly known as the 1619 Project. And at the basis of 1619 is the first moment that some people from Africa were brought here against their will and brought into the workforce on a plantation in Virginia. So they were people who were brought on a ship. I think they came from the Caribbean. They were sold. There wasn't an actual buying and selling. The question of whether we use the term slave or not is something we'll probably get into later. And so the idea as I understand it, behind the New York Times was to then call into question, and I'm sure they would say to, in a good faith way, ask Americans to ponder, what is the founding of the country? Where does the founding of the country begin? And I think that's actually a very fair question. Certainly, some of the criticism to the 1619 Project has been stated along the lines of, well, there wasn't even a United States in 1619, or our founding was in 1776. How can you say 1619? And I think those criticisms miss the mark because most of us would recognize that there's a general sense that people tell the story of our country from the early colonies in the 1600s, and of course, Jamestown, 1608, more famously. So I think it's fair for the New York Times or for Ms. Hannah-Jones to suggest, isn't 1619 perhaps more seminal or worthwhile? And there were several articles. I believe there were like 10 articles in the magazine around the topic. And again, this is 1619, so this is 2019. This is not 2020. It would have been more kind of interesting had it come out in 2020. The fact that it had come out in 1619, and then all the events of 2020 regarding with Mr. Floyd's tragic death and murder, and then the results that came out of that, it kind of dovetailed into and raised the profile, shall we say, of the concept, which was, again, to then suggest we need to recognize 1619 as a seminal or perhaps founding moment of the country because the articles proposed very little, if any, progress has been made by 2019 to suggest that we've actually solved or completed our journey. And that, of course, is set against the typical American mindset of a United States citizen that our country is multicultural, that we have been on a slow but steady march towards a broadening of liberties, a broadening of freedoms, more and more opportunity. It's the land of opportunity. It's an exceptional nation. These are some of the phrases that are often used. And these authors, and we would have to surmise that the New York Times itself was saying all of that is inaccurate, either completely inaccurate or it's sort of overstated. Yeah, we've made some progress, but it's been a little bit of progress. And there's different aspects of things that were in the various articles that suggested, we could say, a pretty dark understanding. In other words, that their take on America in 2019 and the journey the country had been on, either from 1619, so 400 years, or from 1776, has been flawed, terrible, perhaps even horrific, and worthy of censure rather than worthy of celebration. So that's the basics of the idea. Again, since the time then of its publication in early 2019, and then all the events of 2020, she won the Pulitzer Prize for it. The Times won other awards, as I understand it, for the work. And there have been, it's been widely celebrated by a variety of people, both within academia and outside of academia. And there has been effort made or suggestions made, both by the Times and by others, to say this should be taught in school. Now, the quote-unquote this depends on who you're asking. So for some people, this means the idea that we perhaps should question some of the commonly held views. And for other people, this is that the founding of the country was in 1619, that there's been no positive or very little positive that's been made by the country since that time, particularly in regards to race. And that the country's, it's not a good place. It's not really got good people, particularly people who look like you and I, are if not bad, then neutrally bad, because we don't really get out and fight in the trenches to make the world a better place, because clearly it's not a good place. Look at the country is kind of the argument. And it's that second this, quote unquote, that people really push back against. And so you then have had through 20 and now into 21 various states and state boards of education deciding how we're going to implement or not going to implement. And so some states, including ours of Florida, have passed laws that specifically call out what's called critical race theory, which is not something that was born out of the 1619 project, but they're kind of, you can put them hand in glove together. And say, we're not ever going to teach that. And what they're saying is we're not teaching that second this, but then some critics say, but you're also missing the first this that I just said, of a broad, thoughtful discussion, right? One of the things, so she had an interview in August of 2019 with PBS, and one of the things that she said was that she wanted the project to be, and I'm going to quote her, that we could include, quoting, thought about an institution that has impacted almost everything in modern American society, but that we're taught very little about, that we're often taught as marginal to the American story. And she means slavery, that's quote unquote. Well, I don't know where she grew up, but growing up in East Tennessee where I grew up, it was taught a lot. And then now myself in Florida as a professor, it's taught as a central part of the story. So the idea that it's not been taught, maybe, I don't know where she grew up, but maybe where she grew up, she heard nothing about slavery ever, never heard, the idea of slaves coming into the country, 1619, whether that specific year is taught or not, I personally don't think is as critical as some people might think. So her viewpoint, at least in August of 2019, was that this is not taught. Now, I think if you mined that and said, why do you believe that? She would again say, well, look at the world in 2019, America. And then, of course, certainly in 2020, after George Floyd and those other events, they would just go, see? And that raises all kinds of conversation, which I'm sure we'll have and others have, about how you define events, what definitions are you using, how do you kind of decide as a society what topics you teach children, in school. But so that's kind of, I think, a fair nutshell of kind of the 1619 project and how it kind of has lived its life for the past 2 years.
Okay, so like I said, I didn't do any research on this, but obviously I've heard about it, and I've seen some things on it, and I've seen a few historians talk about it. And what they said is they felt like this really had the potential to be something that we could talk about slavery in a raw way that would be helpful, but that she actually took some liberties with the truth. Even in the first sentence, where you said, in 1619 these 20 individuals came over here against their will, and yet from what these historians said is that they were not slaves, they were indentured servants, and after they served their indentured servitude, they were free people, and they went amongst the free society. So they weren't slaves as we know slavery to be, that you were born a slave and you died a slave. There was never a point where you were free. So whether that was deliberate, where she took liberties with the truth, or she didn't know, I think part of the pushback is like, if you're going to teach this, then you need to teach the truth and what really happened, and not push a narrative that you're looking to push because you believe something, because you believe that things haven't gotten better over the years with race, relations.
Yeah.
And because we know that it has. We know that we've made great progress. It may not seem so because in the times that we live in, I'd always like to use Karens, because it's like people see, it's funny because I've seen Karens my whole life. And yet it seems like all of a sudden people are aware of Karens because we all have phones with cameras on them.
Yeah.
And I go, they've been around forever. You just never saw them because we didn't have camera phones. That's all. But but now it seems like, the Karen problem is worse than it's ever been. But it's not. You're just more aware of it. And if anything, it has gotten better because these Karens now know there are camera phones out there, and they better think twice before they start acting the fool. So,
which is interesting. Even using the term, which I refuse to use, it's a pejorative, right? It'd be no different than using the N-word to describe a group of people that has a viewpoint that you find disgusting or that you don't appreciate. And so when people say that, to me, it's particularly when it's coming from a certain point of view, it's reflective of a judgmental, discriminatory way of describing people without getting to know the individual. And we would be better off if we kind of could step back and kind of work in this individual and that individual and this individual. We don't like to do that because it's harder. It's harder to get into the nuance. Your point about the real pushback is about how one wishes to define the country as we find it today. How does it operate? Is it fair? Is it open? Is it open-minded? I think you and I have had more than one conversation where we would conclude that there are issues or problems that you and I at least don't like, or at least one of us doesn't like, and feels like could be fixed or should be fixed to make for to quote the Constitution, a more common unit, kind of a better place, the improvement for all of society, a general goodness for all kind of a thing. And yet, having said those things, does one then say the whole experiment or the whole is corrupt? It's sort of like I've got a bunch of blueberries in my house, and as I was making a smoothie this morning, I'm picking out some of the bad ones. Do I say the blueberries are all corrupt or bad, or do I just say, no, there's just a few issues here, and I pick them out, but in general, the blueberry experiment is still a positive?
Right.
And that's where the real pushback comes, which is why a lot of people in a lot of states, I think, have moved the way they've moved, because they do feel like the Times, and perhaps Miss Hannah Jones in specific, but the Times in general, has is going out of its way to make a statement about their view of the country. And now I think what they're hoping is that people would say, yes, I agree with you, now let's make the world better. That's a whole different part of the conversation. But again, is the whole bunch of blueberries bad? Well, they would say yes based on the way that they've positioned this. Now, whether they would really say yes, I don't know. But the implication sure seems to be that all of it's bad. And that's where you get this kind of pushback.
Well, what I see is I see two sides that refuse to see the other side's
That's
point
true.
of view.
I agree.
And, on one side, I've seen in fact, I even spoke to one. She had reached out to me to be on my show. And after talking with her, we both decided it wouldn't be a good idea to have her on my show because she wants to teach about diversity and race, and she goes to businesses and stuff like that, and she talks about it, but she doesn't want to be challenged. Her whole concept are white people bad.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, I'm not going to buy into that, and I'm not going to let you push that narrative without challenging you.
Yep.
I'll let you say what you have to say, but I'm going to challenge you. And she didn't want to be challenged. She wanted to be accepted as gospel truth. And I go, no, that's not going to happen.
Right.
Then on the other side, we have those who refuse to understand that there still are issues and race issues out there that do, affect black people, and why they or even people of color, whether they're black or not,
that have legacy. Right. That's one of the things in the 1619 Project is in some, not in Miss Hannah Jones's article necessarily, but in some of the other articles that problems that we look at today. Healthcare. One of the articles was something about basically 1619 causes your traffic jam today, and so traffic patterns and traffic problems are all rooted in the events in 1619 and basically more broadly in slavery. And those are fair. I don't know. I wouldn't say I don't know enough to say traffic patterns, but I know the argument the guy was making. But in general, as we've talked about in here, I've said it before in this program, that, for instance, that almost all of our issues that we've suffered through today and the challenges of racial interactions, of all races interacting in this country, I offer or suggest are because of the failure in Reconstruction. So that's 160-something years ago that you have this failure by the political leadership, starting with Abraham Lincoln. And so I agree with the authors and the sentiment of the 1619 Project that for us to best understand, and here I would say all of our issues in our society, you have to have a historical context.
Yes.
I do a volunteer program at one of our local senior centers, and I bring in professors to teach from Valencia on different topics, and usually it's me, but I have some professors I bring in. And so when it's me, it's historical topics. And we're doing basically a year-long road to World War I. That's basically what we're doing. And so we were laying out yesterday the outcome of how Germany formed in the 1870s, 1860s. And the short version to my point was then at the very end, I was then able to point out a few things that I knew they would already know about how World War I in 1914. And they're like, I know this. I'm like, right. And that's because of this thing I just told you in 1865, 1868. And you could just see them kind of shudder and their eyes popped open. And I had one person come up to me and said, I lived in Germany. I was born in Germany, and I didn't know this stuff. So to me, which is why I love teaching history and why I think history is so vital, regardless of the topic, in modern times that we want to discuss, you have to have historical context if you're really going to understand it. And I would suggest you can't really find solutions if you don't really want to understand it. Ergo, know the history. So I appreciate what they're doing in the sense of highlighting to those who might wish to dismiss it or act as if there's no problems. And if you want to say that there's no problems or everything is perfect, well, I would say you're just not looking. Or you may have a bias against a certain group of people who are making the claim.
Right. So I'm glad you brought that up, because last time you and I talked, I think I always like to think, I keep things in context. But in this particular case, and you're so kind, that you probably like, yeah, Kurt, you're not doing that, but you wouldn't say anything. So one of the things we talked about was Jefferson and the fact that he was completely against slavery, but he owned slaves. And I said, well, isn't that hypocritical? And I had to think about it, and I thought about it because of you. And I thought about it, and I realized that to him, he may have opposed slavery, but I know that the founding fathers, they had a dilemma on their hands. They didn't feel like they could end slavery and still win the war against England. That they, for whatever reason, they needed that institution to remain as is, whether it be for soldiers or whatever, whatever their cause was. They, in context, it wasn't as if those people looked at black people and were racist, which we tend to go, oh, they must have been racist. They
Correct.
didn't look at black people like that, and I think it's important, like you said, to put it in context. How did they see black people then? What were they racist?
Yeah. Well, so this is a great. So let's if you are willing.
Yes.
What we need to do really is kind of back all the way up and say, what do we need to understand about the concept of slavery? What do we need to understand? So you mentioned earlier, in the first line, she makes the statement about the 20 individuals being sold into slavery. And historians have pushed back and said, well, technically they were indentured servants. And they're right, they were indentured servants. And so I think for a person today, we kind of just go, I don't even know what all that means. I don't understand what it means, and then kind of what does it imply. And so there's a lot of ground to kind of cover here.
Well, I want you
so
to
you probably should ask me some questions, otherwise I'll drift.
No, I want you to, because I think this conversation that we're about to have, I think this is where it needs to start. We need to be able to define these things, what they meant then,
Sure.
what they mean now, in order for us to have a real understanding and a truer sense of what the picture is really, what it really looks like.
Right. So where I think it's vital to start is the idea that, unfortunately, the concept of oppressing another person in some capacity has been historically true from the moment we've recorded history to this very day. And the way I tell my students is, don't get on your high horse and your judgmental box and point your finger back at the founders until you tell me you are actively working in the year 2021 to end slavery today. Because slavery is alive and well today, and it's in your state, and it's in our city or the region of Central Florida. And we don't want to talk about it. It's in it's caused some of the products that you buy to be the price that they are. And if you really want to judge the founders, go right ahead, but only after you produce your bona fides that shows that you are actively on the front lines of ending slavery today. Most people aren't, and that usually stops the conversation. So since I know the idea of oppression to another person in some capacity, and slavery as an example of that, of the conquering in some capacity, in some way, economically, usually by force, military force, and taking a people and taking a person or a people from who they belong to, their family, their tribe, and then owning them, and then doing whatever I wish with them, whether that's sexual wish, whether that's selling them, whether they're making them do different things. That has been the human condition from day one to today.
And let me just stop you there.
Feel free to interrupt the whole time.
Because I want you to elaborate on this. So because I think this is so important, because people, again, I think the ones who are on the one side who won't listen is that the white people are bad, all thing, and they always generalize, and they're not the only one. Everyone generalizes, but it's like when you say all white people are racist, that's untrue. It's just factually untrue. And for you to say that is careless. And you say, oh, well, if you're not racist, then you wouldn't be offended. Yes, I would. You just said, if you said, oh, I'm overweight, I would be offended. If I'm not, right now I am, so I'd be okay. But like you said, from the beginning of time, one of the things you always see is Native Americans saying, "Oh, we're all illegals." It's like because you came over here and yes, what we did was horrible. There's no making excuses about that.
What we did was what had always
Right.
been done.
But everybody, in fact, the American Indians, who the Navajo would fight the
Right.
Apaches and take them as slaves.
Part of the challenges we're having today with the issues of immigration, and in particular immigration where people are fleeing trauma, right? So think of the Syrians, right? And the reason it's so controversial is because we're alive in one of the first times, I would say the first time, maybe I should have said one of the only times, but I think the first time and the only time in human history in which it was assumed that there were borders and boundaries from which people did not crisscross over. Meaning, the historical story from our whole 6,500 years of recorded history is that peoples move. And at times, the clash of cultures is the phrase to use, the one I use. They overwhelm the place and people that they're going to. And they don't overwhelm them nicely. They don't just integrate. They eliminate or force out. One of my favorite examples is one of my favorite first peoples, Native American peoples, is the Comanches. They rolled into what is now West Texas, part of Arizona, New Mexico, and they ran out the Apaches. Now, if you know your old American cowboy movies and TV shows from the 60s and 70s, the Apaches were one of the bad guys. They're one of the tough guys.
Right.
They kill all the other people and scalp people, and they're scary. They were run out of their own lands by the Comanche, which tell you the Comanche were worse or tougher or
Right.
harsher. But the point is, that happened. These people migrated in. They found a people that they interacted with and they believed they could conquer or have dominion over, right? The Aztecs had over 5 million people in slavery. That's not to castigate the Aztecs or the Native Americans, but to just highlight that this is a problem. Slavery exists throughout all of human history. It's been done by every race to every other race. Most often, it is done by the same race to the same race, meaning you sometimes see olive-colored skinned people buying and selling and enslaving darker colored skinned people or people with Asian features somehow or successfully controlling people with more European features. But in general, unfortunately, slavery has always, or the oppression of another person has always been within a race, right? So that, again, that's not to say, well, so you just give the Americans a pass, or better stated, the Europeans. Not at all. Not at all. But it is to acknowledge that this is a human condition, that this is a human institution that has existed. So, meaning in 1776, why would anyone surmise or suppose that a specific group would just magically out of nowhere decide they want that institution to close? We can say we wish it in 2021, but we have to say that and at the same time acknowledge, but we're allowing slavery to exist this very day in your city. So if you could say no slavery exists where I live, and I'm out there marching in the streets all the time. I've got a gang. We go to brothels and we bust up. We don't wait on the cops. We just deal with it. And in our city, there's no slavery. Then you can cast the first stone.
Okay, so I know people are going to go, what do you mean there's slavery in my city? They're going to say, there's no slavery in my city.
I would suggest. Now, in small cities, I don't know where all your listeners are, but you can go do the research. Just feel free. International Justice Mission is a good one to go look at, but there's a lot of places. Just start Googling it, right? That there are people, when I say slave, just what we would mean, what do we mean by slavery, right? So someone who is in a position by which they do not have the freedom to leave the person or the group that they're with, that they are in a forced labor situation, that they are often in cages and often in chains, not necessarily 24 hours a day, but in moments when, like at sleep at night, this kind of a thing. They're in locked scenarios, guarded by other peoples. They're taken forcibly. Some of them are sold in by their parents. Yes, their parents around the globe who we could potentially say, oh, that's because of poverty. Yes, it is. And so it's tragic, but nonetheless, these two adults decided they were going to make some money by selling their kid.
All right, so you're saying that this goes on in the city of Orlando.
This is in the city of Orlando. I wouldn't say that there's any parents that I've ever read of in the city of Orlando who have sold their child.
Okay.
But there are people who are here as slaves who came from another part of the world who were sold into slavery in some cases by their parents. And all you need to do is go drive down OBT and you will see slaves. You don't know they're slaves. And the other impact to us is the economic one, right? And this is the harder one, right? It's hard to find out, is the place that I'm buying from, is the company that I'm buying my clothing or my technology or my goods or my foods from, are they using slave labor? And that's a hard one to find out about. And so I'm not saying that there's an easy solution. You can snap your fingers and you can just be magically immune. It's sort of the same thing with the environment. Oh, I'm against environmental stuff. Do you drive a car? Do you have air conditioning? Then you're not really against it, are you? You're a participant. So again, get off your high horse and quit acting like you're going to tell the rest of us how to live, unless you live in Florida with no air conditioning. And since you just have had some air conditioning issues, that, I know that's a very, kind of present to you, but it's the same sort of thing here. So I'm not suggesting it's easy to solve, but if we could at least start with being more aware and go, wait a minute, there's potentially people in this city, in Disney, around the tourist attraction area, some involved in sex slavery, others involved in other kinds of slavery, and they're literally here and they're enslaved. Yes, and you should go and educate yourself to kind of recognize the signs and be a part of the process. On my door at my office, I've got some materials that I've got printed up that are on my door that talk about, here's a hotline you can call if you know of somebody who's in this scenario. The bigger point for me is to understand that it is inconceivable to imagine that the founders would just magically have thought, when we say all men are created equal and have a right to, that we would mean we're going to end slavery. The bigger picture to see is that there actually were people in 1776. The largest amount of anti-slavery movement and groups were in North America, right? So again, if you say, oh, everybody was a racist, or there was all these hateful things, like, well, then how do you explain that fact?
Right. How do you explain the fact that, that...
So there actually were Americans in Philadelphia and elsewhere who were saying, wait a minute, slavery is not good. And keep in mind that in 1776, up until 1800, all 13 colony states had slaves. So slavery was in all 13. So again, back to Miss Hannah Jones's argument in the 1619 Project, to want to highlight that slavery was deeply embedded in the country is accurate and useful. And people often go, wait, there were slaves in Maine? Maine wasn't one of the states, but there were slaves in the North. Yes, there were. But then in that scenario, you begin to have people in the 1740s, 50s, 60s, 70s saying to themselves and to their neighbors, I don't really think slavery should be something we do. So that the upper states begin the process of manumission, of ending slavery and freeing slaves and economically figuring out how to do it. So that it does, by 1800, become a majority or only Southern issue, right? So, but again, to me, you see that as a positive, that nowhere else on the planet is anybody talking about ending slavery at this moment. They will be in the next couple of decades, but nobody's talking about it. Nobody's doing anything about it. And the Americans are one of the first peoples to begin to take those steps.
And I see that's where I think people miss it. They don't understand that. It's like never, like you said, never in the time in history before has this ever taken place. And that's one of the things I tell, because I'm part of a minority group, and I go, we didn't get our rights, the rights that we have. We didn't get them just based off of what we did. We had to have allies. We didn't have enough people to cause a big enough ruckus to where we could have anything. In any other society throughout history, if we were to do that, we would have been killed. They wouldn't have freed us. They wouldn't have given us rights. They would just go, you're too much of a problem. We'll just destroy you.
And if people look and say, well, that's not true. Come on, Kurt. And they talk about things from the 20th century. And there are now in the 20th and now in the 21st century, several, we would say, liberal states, right? Like us, the United States is a liberal state, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. And I don't mean that in the common use of liberal conservative. but it's a state based in liberalism, which generally means the opportunity and freedoms to some level of the citizens, right? There are other states like us. There are other places that have made advancements and make accommodations and do try to strive to bring equity, right? Where did they learn all that from? They learned it from the United States in 1776. Now, whether you want to use the term exceptional or not, that's fine. But certainly that's a credit to those people to say they did something that has had a significant impact in the world trajectory. If we can say, and I believe it's historically provable, as I've already said, that slavery, for instance, or the oppression of others has been a truism from the moment we have recorded human history, and you have no change in that, not of any significance, not in Athens and Greece, not in Rome, not in Persia, not in China, not in Japan, nowhere in Africa, not in the Americas. You have no evidence of any society either trying to free oppression or stop oppression, right, or live multiculturally. And then you come here and you say, but wait, in the 20th century, you begin to see this across the board. You have to say, well, what was the cause of the change? And you start tracking backwards and you see no real change necessarily in the 1900s, slow beginnings of change. And then you come to this moment here in 1776. And again, I'm artificially saying 1776. I would say more broadly the beginnings of the United States and the ideals that they were purporting. When they wrote all humans, and they wrote all men, but they meant all humans, are created equal. Nobody was saying that. Nobody thought that, because the entire world system was that you clearly were not equal. There was station, and you were trapped in that station. And the Americans were saying, we think it can be different. Now, whether they did that perfectly or not, and I would suggest they didn't, is not the point. They made a transformational move that no one else had made, and then what's the payoff? Look at the world in 2021. Look at our argument right now about whether we should or shouldn't leave Afghanistan. I heard an interview from the BBC, with a German news agency that I like to watch. They interviewed former President George W. Bush. And they were talking about him with Angela Merkel, but they were talking about Afghanistan. And he expressed his great dismay at the decision. And it's not a Biden decision. Biden and Trump both, Obama had said it, and Biden and Trump have both been trying to work it out. And Bush's concern was for the rights of women in Afghanistan if the Taliban take back over, right? Now, we live in a society where people actually are concerned about the rights of women on some far distant part of the globe. Why? They would not have been concerned about the rights of women in 1775. So there has to be some mark in the ledger to say that is a gold star for those people, because nobody else said it. Nobody else did it. Yes, the English will move first with the leadership of William Wilberforce to outlaw slavery, and they will successfully outlaw slavery by the time you get to 1830, 1840. So they get a gold star for that. Right? And I think Wilberforce and those other abolitionists who worked alongside him, I think it's called the Clapham Society, they I don't think necessarily only drew inspiration from the Americans, but they drew inspiration from the Americans. And so you say, wait a minute, these founders that you're now castigating and suggesting are all evil. When I say the founders, I don't mean just the 55 signers. I mean the 2.5 million people who were living here as citizens. That's not fair to castigate them and not give them credit over the long haul of the journey to say they've done some good.
Right. I know this would only be speculation on your part, but why do you think that they are so reluctant to do that? Just like on the other side, there are people who are reluctant to even admit that slavery was a bad thing. It's like,
yeah. Well, I think both are probably trying to defend a point of view. Both of them are trying to defend their view of the country. I think the first group that you mentioned, probably the group that's not just the 1619 Project, because there's a whole host of historians who are largely on board and feel this is necessary and needed and want to teach it, think it should be taught kind of in its, I would use the word dark as a descriptor, which may not be fair, but its darker take. Because they look at the country in the year 2021 and they ascribe it as dark, as a dark place, a bad place, an evil place. It's evil. It's done great, great harm. It deserves no praise for who it is in the year 2021. and we must call out the evil in order to hopefully find some solution. And that's where those people and I would depart ways.
Yes,
we disagree.
And I'm in agreement with you. It's like, as I've said many times, if you're just looking to complain and you don't have solutions, and you're just going to point out and not acknowledge the good, and as you've aptly pointed out throughout this, about how how the United States kind of led this whole thing, where we were an example because we were the first ones to say, hey, slavery is bad. This is not something that we should want to continue having. And so to not acknowledge that and to pretend as though things are as bad today as they were 400 years ago, or
right.
Is ridiculous. And it's not. And you're not allowing yourself to see the progress, because there has been. And yes, I understand. Again, as I said, the Karen thing, which you find as a pejorative, which I don't, only because I think when somebody is behaving in a certain way that harms others, whether it's a pejorative or not, they deserve it.
They deserve to be called out for the negative behavior. They don't deserve a title. In my opinion, they don't deserve to be labeled with a title. And certainly in this case, there are a lot of people who I personally know who have that name, and it's an offense to them.
I didn't even think about that, so I apologize. Because you're right, there are people out there named Karen who don't act that way. So you're absolutely right. But if we found another name, I don't have a problem labeling them, because they are harmful to people in society, and if it embarrasses them, more good. That's what I want. I want you to be embarrassed so you quit your behavior. But to not acknowledge the progress that we've made, it's like you can't believe you can't see it. I think you have to, that you willingly.
So then we have to be curious,
it.
Right? Like, why would they do that?
Right.
And I mean, obviously, they're not here to speak for themselves. I think a key part of it is definitions, as we've been saying, which again, to me, goes to some degree back to our discussion about postmodernism. If there's no truth, then there's no settled anything. And if you also believe, as postmodernists typically do, that there's an evil mastermind system going on board that has, ruined everything with its false master narrative, which does not accurately depict the setting, then you are already saying, yes, I must oppose any common definition. But then that leaves us in a place where you can use a word like racist or racism, and you can mean a whole ton of different things. I'd like to believe that these people have a good intent, a good heart, and I would offer that one possibility is that they and I would have a vastly different view of human nature, and in that they would look at the murder of George Floyd, and they would see it in a way that they think is systemic, based on their hope and belief that actually all humans are good, and therefore no one should ever die for murder ever. And I would just say, again, the history of the society of humans as a species would suggest that'll never happen.
Right.
So the question isn't, is the country racist because some people have been murdered by, law enforcement? The question is, is the country racist because it has exclusively excluded certain peoples, right? So I would agree we were racist if black people were not allowed to get married. I would believe we were racist if people of color were never allowed to go to high school because they were specifically a person of color. That would be racist. Right. That would be a systemic thing. If you never saw a black person on the police force, if you never saw certain classes of people allowed into certain industries, then you could say there was a discriminatory thing being done to those people. When you see humans acting like humans and being ugly, whether they're police officers or not, and in this case, a police officer, you shouldn't be shocked. You should say, that's human nature.
Yeah, but I think that to their argument, it's that it happens more often to
Does it?
people. Yeah, I will tell you. Look,
have you done the research on it?
I have not done the research on it, but I will tell you anecdotal, and I know that only goes so far.
Sure,
but I've had plenty of black friends, and I cannot tell you one friend in particular, who was a very good friend of mine, we were driving to his house. We were going to go play video games. His father was on the police department. No less than 3 times did we get pulled over. He wasn't doing anything, and he was driving one of his little Toyota, box cars.
So driving while black,
right? And we got pulled over because there was a black guy and a white guy in the car. So there had to be something. There had to be something going on. Now, you can say, well, that this person's not a good person, but the fact is that this person grew up.
No, I'm just talking about the murder part.
Oh yeah,
so, driving while black, that does happen. So then again, the nuance that there is some that does happen more than I think white people being stopped.
Right, it absolutely does. But see, it lends itself because not only do they get stopped more, it's what happens after they get stopped.
Sure.
And it doesn't just happen to people of color. It happens to people of color, and it happens to poor people way more often than it does of people who are affluent. And so, but if you are poor and black, you're in big trouble. I mean, and even blacks who are affluent have to worry about things that white people who are affluent don't have to worry about, and they do. And I've seen it. And again, I was an MP in the Army. I watched people who I worked with treat black people differently than they did white people.
Yeah. So
there is this systemic racism, not just in the police departments, but throughout, where you said earlier, that you were poor middle class and that, that you didn't have any privilege. And I would agree that we don't, I lived in the projects, but if we don't acknowledge the fact that just being white gives us 1 foot up, even if it's only a little bit, it gives us an advantage that others don't have. Now, I happen to adhere to the belief that that's not a bad thing. I am not going to apologize for that, and I'm not going to give up any advantages I have. But the problem isn't that I have an advantage. The problem is that others don't, and we need to bring them up to where they have the same advantages that the rest of us have.
Correct.
And fix the problem that way, not take things away from me, but give things more to those who don't have.
Right.
So
with policing, right? So on that aspect, not the shooting and killing part.
Right.
Right. Again, I think it'd be fair to say, well, let's look at the experience of African Americans from 1865 forward, and then conclude, is it better or worse or flatlined? And I would suggest the evidence is that it's better. Doesn't mean it's perfect.
And I agree with you.
No,
yes.
It's not perfect, right? And I think, again, one of the benefits of something like the 1619 Project, asking all Americans to become more introspective, more thoughtful. Because if we say there's a sector of people, in all people, but the same percentage would be true in police, who do look at people of color a certain way or look at some race a certain way, it has to be stated that if you were Italian or Irish in this country in the 19th century, you were as almost, I won't say equally, but you were nearly equally as discriminated and treated horribly by police as a person of color, right? If you were Asian on the West Coast, and I don't know if people want to say whether they are not part of the people of color, character, title, right? They were treated as equally bad as African Americans. Let's say it started in 1866, so post-slavery, right? And so it's not when it gets talked about in terms of aiming only at one certain race group, and you won't acknowledge, for instance, that, well, Irish people are not, my background is Germanic, right? So go look at the experience of Russians, Czechs, Hungarians, Serbians, Bosnians in this country or in other parts of the world in this time period. And what you realize is, there was kind of a hierarchical view of race, but it didn't have anything to do with color. It was just, there's this certain group that viewed itself a certain way and saw most other people as lesser than them, to their detriment. They should not have done that.
Right.
But when you go and you say, okay, well, back to the racism thing, and is it systemic? You say, well, we've got this group of people. How do we fix that? Right? Alerting them through education, I think, is a benefit. I mean, it is a way to get there. But is it the panacea that so many really seem to suggest? I would offer no. Because again, you've got 6,500 years of history that suggests there's something hardwired in the human to see things in terms of likeness and sameness, and then those different from me in terms of distrust or even a negative viewpoint.
So when you say, that people should be taught, so one of the things that's what they want to do with this is they want to teach, in particular, I think white people, and I think this is why there's a pushback, because white people are like, they don't want to be told what to be taught. To say, look, this is, there has been systemic racism. It continues today. This is what it looks like. This is, this is when we say white privilege. This is what we mean. We don't mean, oh, you're rich and and that you're in because obviously that's not the case. But they want to explain, like, this is the difference between being black and being white in this country, even to today. But I agree with you. They need to acknowledge that things are much better today than they have been. It just seems, again, with camera phones and with internet and it always being in our face, it seems as though things are worse off, and they're not. They're so much better off than they used to be.
But to be critical of the other side, right? So if this story is that everything's horrible, and it all started in 1619, and it's just been flatlined and horrible or marginally better, right? Well, the story from the other side is, okay, things were bad. And then in 1865, we fixed everything. And since then, everything's basically been groovy. And everything's largely okay. Okay, there's a few problems here and there. But generally, things have been great for all peoples, including your people. And that is just categorically false.
Right, but that's the problem, is that there are so many white people out there who believe that.
What happens to these groups, and we could say what I'm about to say, and I think on a lot of topics that are inflammatory or controversial, is that the people doing the most talking don't talk, as I believe you and I are, accepting the nuance and taking the time to kind of walk through it honestly or candidly. They take the inflammatory view. They shout it the loudest. And the moment you say, everything was fine from 65, you offend this group. So then they shout back, no, everything's terrible now, and you offend this group. And you keep going back and forth where the groups become so offended, they lose the ability to listen. It's sort of like you see in societies, and many of them have had them, and we've had them here in the country, Hatfields and the McCoys most famously, when you get this kind of death circle. And you killed my uncle, so I killed your brother. So then you killed my wife, so then I killed your sister. And you just keep going, and there is no break of the cycle till we're all dead. And you see this. There are societies and tribes and peoples who have, for decades, been engulfed in kind of war against one another and hatred, because and sometimes there'll be like maybe 8 or 9 or 10 years where there's nobody died, and then somebody walks on the wrong part of land, or somebody talks to the wrong person, and the next thing you know, they're dead, and then we're off again to the races of killing people. And it comes from that sense of, I've been so deeply aggrieved, rightfully so, because you have deeply aggrieved me, but my response is to aggrieve you back, rather than, from a Christian point of view, turn the other cheek, which is very hard to do because you have been aggrieved. And if it's the killing part, then it's deeply aggrieved. If it's you insulted me because you said everything's great since 65 when we know it's not, or you insulted me because you say everything's terrible when I know it's not terrible, or you call me privileged when I'm poor, that's not as bad as somebody getting killed, but still the affront still feels that way. And the more it's stated, the more agitated the aggrieved person becomes, in my opinion, then therefore losing their ability to be reflective.
Well, so here's the thing. You're right. And I think what happens is like what we've talked about before, is that these people who are doing the talking the loudest, I don't think they speak for the majority of people on either group. And here's what happens. So if you have on the one side, these extremists or whatever you want to call them, who shout the loudest and say, nothing good has happened, everything's flatlined, and and white people are the devil. What it does is it takes every white person who had any type of empathy, sympathy, support, whatever, and goes, wait, I'm on your side. And again, this lady who wanted to be on my show, she didn't care. She goes, I don't believe in allies.
Wow.
I would go, what?
Well, that's one of the pieces from the 1619 Project is the suggestion, and this is from Miss Hannah Jones, that all whatever progress has been only made by the African American community itself.
That's ridiculous.
It's historically inaccurate.
And not only that, it's impossible. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's just common sense that whatever group is in power, they have the power to either allow you to do something or not allow. If you're a minority and you don't have the power to fight back, you will get crushed. You will get killed. Without their okay, without them at the very least being apathetic and not caring what you do and just ignoring you, you aren't going to do anything without their okay. And to think that you are it's ludicrous. And I can't even, and then again, that's where you get people who want to go, yes, we need to have this honest discussion, but you can't say things that are just untrue like that. You can't say the only way, that people of color have gotten to where they're at is because of what they've done is just as silly as gay people saying the only reason we've got the rights we've got is because we're the ones who fought for them. Yes, we fought for them, but without the straight allies, we would have gotten nothing. Right. Nothing. And if you think that we would have, you're sadly mistaken and you're delusional. You think way too much of yourself.
If you raise the issue of there being those who agree with you who aren't like you, right? To use that term loosely, right? Then you have to admit that there actually is evidence of change within the society.
Right.
Right. And
you
don't want to admit
that. Yeah, exactly.
Which kind of gets to one of the key points for me, why I guess I push back the most against critical race theory and just in general, like not wanting to be on their bandwagon, is because they, to me, never seem to actually offer solutions.
Right.
Right. And one of the things that I guess I feel like with a lot of groups, left and right, is that I often hear them, if they do offer solutions, they're so highly partisan, they're never going to get passed.
Right.
But they're never really actually interested in finding a path forward that is better or workable, that has some better. And you start going, do you really want the problem solved that you have raised as this great danger to us all? Or are you somehow so entrenched that financially as a business, it's to your benefit that the problem continued to exist? And I personally find myself almost always concluding the latter is the case.
I agree.
I mean, I've sat with some activists. I don't even tell you what type of group it was, and individuals, and I've said to them, well, let's imagine you and I have the full control over the planet. Let's fix this. Trying to just do a thought exercise of saying, are there actual workable solutions? Because, sometimes, Kurt, the answer is there isn't actually a solution. There's no way to fix what you think should be fixed. And this person, this is 2 or 3 times I've had these kinds of conversations. They're like, no, I won't do that. And I'm like, just me and you. No, because later you'll trap me. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Because you'll want there to be a solution. I'm like, yes, don't you want there to be a solution?
Right.
No, I don't want there to be a solution.
Right. That's exactly right. And I agree with you. In more cases than not, I believe it comes down to the money. And it's like, if you I learned this a long time ago. That said, if you want to know why people do things, always follow the money. That's why they do it. And almost invariably, it's always true.
Yep.
And regardless. And we had talked about this before where, I said, and I'm not going to call out the group online, but, I'm a big fan of rhinos. I love rhinos. And so I support, the animal. And I support the rhino orphanage over in South Africa because here's a group who says, we take care of baby rhinos who are orphaned because their parents were killed or the mother was killed for a horn or it was attacked by hyenas or whatever, or whatever the case may be. They take in these baby rhinos and they take care of them. And the man who's the head of it said, I don't want to be in business. I want there to never be rhinos who are poached. And so I'm like, this guy gets it. He doesn't want to continue taking care of baby rhinos and allowing poaching so that he continues to make money and it becomes this money thing.
Right.
Instead, he ends up paying out of his own pocket, and fortunately, I guess he has the ability to do that.
That's good.
But there are other foundations, which I won't mention, who don't care about ending poaching, because if they end poaching, then there goes their funding, there goes their money, there goes then they'll have to go get another job, and it's sad that and that's just one of every area is like that. I can tell you there's a group here in Florida for LGBTQ community who they don't want all the problems solved. They don't want us to have equal rights throughout, because then where do they go? What do they do?
Right.
They're no longer needed.
Right.
And that salary that of the person that's heading that of $150,000+ a year is not going to go find another job that pays our $150,000 a year.
And they don't want to accept that actually we do have equal rights. Right. So again, back to systemic racism. If we can find police forces in which the writing, either clearly stated or subtly taught but still enforced within a certain police force, a state or a city or whatever, instructs them to make sure you pull over a certain number of black people every day, or that they are told black people deserve to be pulled over more, then you can say you have institutional racism. And then therefore we could say there's not equal rights for the people in that city, because those black people by institutional law are pulled over more. Right? If it's just that in the philosophy and background of a people, they have been taught subconsciously to see a certain race as beneath them or as more dangerous, which clearly that has happened in this country, then you don't have you don't have institutional racism, but you have a problem within, again, the human condition about what's happened here. And back to the 1619 Project, you have failed to highlight the history that does talk about how policing has been used to negatively enforce. There was a time when there was institutional racism very clearly in this country. And that's still close enough to us in time that even though it's no longer the law, there are people alive who are still living when it was the law. So we got to keep moving forward, both highlighting the fact that there was this time, and so then we need to change the subconscious in the ether, right? The behind the scenes to see a certain person as dangerous, which will come over time. And then in that overtimeness, you then are in a position to increasingly make things better, more fair, more just, right? Where the police officer on his or her own does not see a certain person of a certain skin color as necessarily more dangerous, and then therefore unfairly pull them over. But as we do that, you then, as the critic, don't say, well, we still have institutional racism, or we don't have equal rights. Like, yes, you do. You have equal rights. You don't have equal experience.
All right, so I'll push back on that just a little bit, only because, all right, well, let's just go with LGBTQ first. There are still rights that they don't have. Such as there are in certain states, they can still be denied housing. They can still be denied jobs. Right. They can still be denied adoptions.
By law.
By law.
Okay.
Because they're not considered protected completely yet. So these states can discriminate against.
I'm just asking. In the law, it says, or for this business, if a gay person or LGBTQ person comes, you have the right to deny them the job.
All right, so that's not written into law. There's no law that stops them. So up until just like for instance, there was Cracker Barrel would fire people for being gay. They quit doing that practice because they couldn't have a business in some city like Orlando who says we don't allow that. So if you're going to have a Cracker Barrel here, you can't fire people because they're gay. And the same thing with housing. There's no law that says, you can discriminate. You are allowed to discriminate unless there's a law that says you can't. Now, the same thing with blacks in police forces. There are sheriff's departments where they're led by a sheriff who is a racist, and because of who he is, the police force becomes racist. When you can pull up what a police officer's file and show what his how many people he's pulled over in a year and how many of them were black, you can see okay, we might have a problem here, but
Right.
they don't do that because they're okay with it. And we do have, unfortunately, police departments that are racist because of who leads that police department. And I've
Yeah.
said this many times: you can't have bad cops on the street unless you have a bad leader.
Yeah, I said I would disagree with that because of my view
no,
of human nature.
Right, and I'll take that back. Yes, you can.
The
But
leader can make them worse.
the leader. The thing is that a good leader will see that what's going on
Sure.
and get rid of them.
We'll work to
Right.
we'll work to change.
Right, exactly.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
See,
so,
I wouldn't use the term racism there though, or racist. You said, I forget now when you said it, but that'd be me wanting to find we need a different category or a different type of terminology to express what we're saying.
Okay.
Because it's like, well, unless you're going to point to a law that says something, the fact that there's an absence of a law, which then allows someone who therefore is acting in an ugly way, doesn't make the society or the system racist. It makes the person racist.
But if the society allows it to happen, it's just like with
Sure.
let's say LGBTQ. Let's say that the city doesn't take the
For housing, right.
for housing, that they don't do like Orlando, and they're proactive about it and say, no, you're not going to be allowed to do that. Let's say you're in some city in Texas, it goes, yeah, we're not going to make a law. Yeah, they can do what they want. You are at the very least, you're allowing it to happen.
Right. You are allowing a discriminatory way to happen, particularly if people come forward saying, hey, I was with a realtor, they found out I was gay, and then they wouldn't. We had 3 houses we already had picked out we wanted to look at from Zillow, and then they wouldn't take us.
Right.
Then you are in a position where you can say, certainly the realtors are racist, and maybe the housing place they were going to go, they knew was or not racist, but discriminatory
Right.
against gay people, and then they knew that there's no reason to go there because they won't let you have the place because the HOA or somebody else would work against your buying the place. So yeah, and again, I guess I want there to be, because not to defend these people, but I want to be able to preserve the word racist or racism for its usefulness.
Right.
And
I get that. Yeah.
Once you get to where it's like a extraordinarily broad phrase, then you get back to the place where now you've offended me because you called me fat when I'm not fat. I may be a little, what I think, overweight, but you've called me fat, using your example from
Right.
earlier, right? And so I'm offended, right? And even though maybe you need to be offended because the thing we're trying to point out is useful, once I've used a word that you take in the wrong way, or I maybe use the word wrongly or too broadly, then I've lost the whole conversation. It would actually maybe be to my benefit to lose some weight, and it might be to my benefit for you to point that out to me. But there's a way to do it that raises a good conversation, as opposed to a way to do it to offend me.
You make a very good point, because when we overuse words like racism or racist, and we call everybody that, it demeans the word. It takes away its power. And so when we can use the word to describe someone who truly is racist, it doesn't have the same meaning, because now you're calling everybody. So when you say all white people are racist, now that word has no meaning to me, because you've used it in such a way that you've taken away its power. It's like when I told this lady one time who said that when you use the wrong pronouns, that's violence. And I go, what are you talking about? It is, you cannot call something just because someone doesn't call you by the pronoun that you want to be called and say that's violence. I go, when I punch you in the face, that's violence. I go, when you use the word violence for something so stupid like this, all those people who suffered violence by, real violence, you've just demeaned that word to where it doesn't have any meaning, and no one's going to think violence is anything anymore because of your misuse of it. So you make a great point with that.
Now I'm going to be thinking about our conversation through the next couple of weeks and see if we can come up with something that would work for me, because I get the point of what you're saying. I guess it's the absence of a law somehow allows for behavior, and so then what's a good way to describe that? Maybe it end up is maybe racism is the way, or discrimination is the way. It is discriminatory. I guess the question in my head is I just don't, and we've had this before. It was at the end of one of our discussions, and we were really back and forth. It was quick, and we didn't go into depth on it. But I would continue to say I don't see the example of institutional racism. That's not the phrase. What's the phrase? Oh shoot! Now I just lost it. There's a phrase that's used, systemic racism.
Right.
And I'm like, I don't see systemic racism. And I say that because back to the police officer, I don't know of a police force or police chief where there is a written, or as an example you gave, even subtle suggestion of you need to stop this many black motorists.
What about what's that guy's name out in Arizona? Joe, whatever his name was.
I've never examined their place, but I would be. It's sort of like, now I'm about to tiptoe into another minefield. I find zero evidence that there is zero evidence. I think largely there is limited or no evidence that there is actually a moment where women and men are paid separately for the same job.
I agree.
And so I think that there are examples that women can point to, particularly in the arts, which I think have merit and should be pointed out. But in the average, and we'll go to to this place or that place and say, show me your salary structure. I don't think you're going to find all the women are paid. And once everything else is equalized, this woman is paid less than that man. And so I feel the same way about the police force kind of a thing. Maybe it's very possible somebody one of your listeners could say, oh, look, I've already looked it up, and here's so-and-so police force, in which written into law, it says very clearly you must stop or you must be more concerned about black motorists.
Well, there certainly have been captains or chiefs or sheriffs that have told their police departments that.
How do you know that, though?
Because I've been one.
Okay.
So I've seen.
You were a police officer?
Yeah, I was.
I didn't know that.
Now I was a police officer in the military.
Oh, okay.
But
yeah, you said that.
We had a lot of the very same things that you're going to find in the civilian police department. I mean, there's nothing that they do that we didn't do.
Right.
So, and so I saw it firsthand. And again, if you allow it, and this is where I would push back. If you have a city, and it has practice, it doesn't say, oh, you can discriminate, but it doesn't have laws to where you can't discriminate. Then you're at the very least being apathetic and allowing it to happen. So if you let businesses come in and discriminate against gay people, I would say, there's. I don't know if you would call it systemic, but it certainly is part of the system that's allowing it to happen, because they could certainly stop it. So, I don't know if systemic is the right word, but there certainly are. Again, I've seen police departments where why were black people pulled over? Because they believe in their heads that black people commit more crimes. And and it really doesn't come down to black people. It comes down to poverty. It comes down to not having, and so.
Well, I do want to be clear for your listeners that I actually take a more, I think more encompassing view about race and racism. I think racism is alive and well in the country.
Right.
And then I'm going to probably offend a lot of your listeners. I think everybody I know is a racist. Because everybody I know is human, and every human that I know thinks in terms of sameness.
Okay.
And that they then therefore look at those who are not like them, and this is in varying and sundry ways. Now, in our country, in the place that I've ever lived, people aren't walking around with weapons and chopping off people's hands and heads, and every time you go to the mall, there's not a brawl that breaks out between different groups. But all you have to do, in my opinion, is walk through a mall or walk through a theme park or walk into a school, and you'll see all the same kids who are roughly the same color sitting together. They're not forced to sit together. They do so out of a sameness. Occasionally there'll be some differences that break across these barriers, and it's not a bad thing that a whole bunch of Asian people are walking together through Universal, and then over there's a whole bunch of Hispanic people. We typically would think they're probably family or friends, but we're not surprised by that, and that they all end up sitting. My wife, I think you all know she's a nurse. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but she just went to a meal that they had, a common meal, I'll just say it that way. And she got there late. She was coming off a shift. And she said, I was really stunned when I walked in, and it was a larger group of her peers, and all the Hispanic women or participants were sitting together, and all the black participants were sitting together. And this is a modern workforce where they work together all the time and share things, but in their loose commonness of being able to share a meal together, they naturally gravitated to these places.
Yeah, but I wouldn't call that racism, and I wouldn't call it racist because that's not what racism is. Racism is believing that you're better than a race or that you hate a race because
That's
of their
fair.
color. But what I call it is biasness or preference because
Sure.
we are tribal,
Sure.
and you're right. There's nothing wrong with that, because we're going to gravitate towards people who are like us. So if I'm in a room and there's bodybuilders over here and there's neuroscientists over here, well, that wasn't a good one.
Historians over here.
No, because I love history too. A bunch of IT guys with computers.
Yeah.
I'm going to the bodybuilders because that's who I relate to. That's
Yes.
who I know better. That's who I feel more comfortable with. It's not to say that there's anything wrong with these guys. I just don't understand them. They don't understand me. And I will want, and if I had an interest, I would go to them and I'd want to know. Like, that's why I said neuroscientists, because if there were neuroscientists in the room, I would gravitate there because I want to learn from them.
But don't you think in that example of those groups that there would be a high likelihood that someone might make a casual, not harsh, but a casual joke or statement that could be taken as a put down to the other group?
Well,
because they're not, in this example, they're not as strong as us bodybuilders, or we accuse the bodybuilders of being dumb.
Right, and that's the thing. It's like, again, I don't believe that's racism or whatever, or sexism or any other ism out there. When you go, okay, because you're going to always want to build yourself up. You're always going to want to feel good about yourself. So bodybuilders are going to go over there and go, oh, look at those little nerds over there. They can't lift, they can't lift 5 pounds. And the IT guys are going to go, look at those muscleheads over there. They couldn't open up a computer if their life depended on it.
Right.
It's like,
right.
And so it's not that it's not mean spirited. It's not like, but they just like going, oh, I feel good about my. So we say something that makes us feel better about ourselves, so we don't feel less than other groups.
Okay, but for me then, that's when your point about racism is fair, and I take it. But that for me is in that arena, what you just described about the meatheads or the weaklings or whatever, those nerds over there, because it is said in a pejorative way. Even if it's said with a laugh and with it's not fun kind of a thing, it's said in a way that elevates us and decreases them. But and when that's done with race as opposed to business types or body types kind of a thing, it fits into a way that I think, at least loosely, is separating.
Okay, so let me just give you for instance here. Oh, my little rhino.
Fix the rhino.
Yeah. This is the one that I just got a friend of mine who was a guest. Well, she's a friend now. She wasn't a friend when she was a guest, but she was a guest on my show, and she sent me this little rhino. She's so
awesome.
cool. Yeah, she's
awesome.
very cool. Let me give you a little pushback here. When, for instance, I think intent is everything. I truly believe intent is everything. So if you're saying, oh, look how big I am and how strong I am, I can lift 10 times more than these guys, it's not putting them down. I'm building myself up. It's not to say they're less than me. It's like I'm just trying to make myself feel good. I watch straight guys all the time, and it's funny, and I laugh about it because I know they don't mean anything by it. Or I will say, at least the people I know. I'm sure there's straight guys out there who look down upon gay guys and think that they're more masculine, and that and the problem with that is that I'm one of those guys who can beat straight guys in all the straight games that they think are manly. I can beat them in it, and they don't know how to handle that. But I know that there are guys out there who are even friendly with gay guys, but they think because they're straight, they're better. They think they're better at sports. They think they're better at all these things because it makes them feel good. Now, they don't have any ill intent to say, oh, gay guys can't play sports, or gay guys are wusses, or whatever, because that's not their intent. Now, there are gay or straight guys out there who do have that intent, and they would be homophobic. But I'm not going to call these other guys homophobic just because they look at themselves maybe as being better than me.
Yeah.
Whether that's true or not, they're just doing it because it makes them feel good about themselves. And so I think there's no harm, there's no ill intent there. There's no desire to hurt me, to put me down. They just want to build themselves up. So I think that's where it comes down to, the intent. If you have the intent to put someone down, to hurt them, then you're a racist.
Okay.
Okay.
That may have merit. Yeah, I can see what you're saying. It's a gray area, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, because you have to know what the person's intent is. But I tend to give people the benefit.
Can you ever know anybody's intent?
Yeah, I think so. I think their actions prove it. I mean, you'll see how they behave around you, whether or not they're,
Fair enough.
So,
yeah,
I always tell people, even though you hear this cliche, it took me a long time, but I do it to heart now. I watch people's actions that will always give them away as to who they are.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So, with that being said, I see the pushback on the one side where they don't want critical race theory taught in the schools, because if you're going to teach it as in the sense that all white people are the devil, and that they're evil, and that they're and basically saying that we invented slavery for that, and ignoring the facts and ignoring history and ignoring the truth, then I can see the pushback. On the other side, I can see wanting to get the truth out and not whitewash it, if you will, and to say, look, we need to take a hard look at this and go, this wasn't a pretty time in our history. But in saying that, but we have made progress.
Right.
And so, again, I think on both sides, you have people who have a lot more in common, who would go, yeah, let's teach it, but let's teach it the honest way. Let's be truthful about what we're truly saying, and let's quit with the political narratives that we're trying to push one agenda over another, and not solve the problem and not find solutions. If you're not going to look for solutions, then shut up.
Yeah, and solutions, I mean, that becomes, to me, the crux of the how do we go forward, is that very few, and it's certainly not in the 1619 project, their solution is let this be taught in school. But to what end? I guess they would say, hopefully, less police officers feel that way.
But you're not going to do that. If you're putting down another group, again, if you're sitting there going, you're the reason, not history, not what people did in the 1800s, 1700s, you are the problem. Your race is the problem, and as long as you exist on this earth,
and there are examples that have happened in business, that have happened in places of work where they've had CRT training, where all the white people had to write apology letters.
Yeah, I would go, fuck you. I'm sorry.
And then they might say you're fired.
And I would go, okay, because because if I have to be dishonest, in order to do that, I don't want to work for you.
Which you have to imagine that in a normal group of people, average people pulled into a room, a large percentage of them would not believe what they were writing. They'd be being dishonest, like you said. So then you look at the group trying to organize it, and they may go, yay, we had this successful meeting. It's like, no, it wasn't successful because you had people that are now mad at you, and they didn't tell you. They weren't candid with you because they were afraid. Well,
here's what I would tell people like that, regardless of what group you are. If you happen to be black and you think, and like this woman who she goes to these companies and pushes that kind of agenda where white people have to write a letter of apology, I would say, what would you do if I came to your company and told you, because you're straight, you have to write an apology to me because I'm gay?
Yeah.
What have you ever done to me? You could say, I've never done anything to you, and I've never used slander against gay people. I support them, but you want me to write a letter of apology? And you see how ridiculous that is?
They don't see how ridiculous it is.
Right.
Their argument that is that neutrality, because you'd suggest I did nothing wrong to gay people, right? Is still makes you complicit.
No, and here's the thing. This is what bugs me the hell out of these people, is because. And I'm talking about the left because I'm on the left and I expect better from them, and yet they continue to disappoint.
Yeah.
Look, you think because I'm being neutral, and first off, I don't happen to be neutral because, like I said, I have a lot of black friends, and so it's not a neutral topic to me. Because it affects me, because they are truly my friends and I want the best for them. I worry about them because I know when they get pulled over that the chances of something that could hurt them or could happen, that they would get harmed, are much greater than if I get pulled over. And so I do worry about them because they're great people. But with that said, I lost my train of thought.
You're about
with this being neutral, that's human nature. We don't care about cancer until somebody in our family gets cancer.
That's true.
You know,
Largely.
So if I'm being neutral, it's not that so if I say, oh well, I've never given to the American Cancer Society because I don't have anybody in my family who's ever had cancer, and they're going to go, well, since you're neutral, you must want people to die of cancer. How stupid is that? Honestly, it's because it doesn't affect me. It's not because I agree with it. It's not because I'm okay with it. It's because I don't think about it, because none of us think about anything other than what our little world revolves, what's in our little world.
Yes.
So that's a stupid assertion, and
and worse, it harms what your stated
Right.
goal should be, right?
Exactly.
I should want to convince you to give to cancer research, right? But because I've offended you, I now have basically ensured that you will never give to cancer research because you're so hurt by the way I described you.
Right.
And you feel marginalized, and so then you walk away. And in fact, you may go and tell your friends not to give to cancer research because of how you were treated.
And I've made that point to them. I have made that point and go, you are doing a disservice to the very thing that you're trying to bring attention to. You're bringing the wrong attention, because now you're taking people who were allies and going, fuck you, I don't want to be a part of you. This is how you're going to treat somebody who is for your cause. Then I'll just stay out of it.
Correct.
So, and I don't get how they don't understand that. I don't understand how if I need your help, and I say, oh, I need Carl to help me out, and I go, Carl, you're a jackass. Now, but hey, I want you to help me. It's like, what are the chances of you helping me now? Going, screw you, Kurt. It's like,
well, and so that we've already covered here once, but just to loop back quickly, it definitely raises in my mind the question of what end game do you have? Because it would seem like your end game in the example back to CRT in particular, I think, is not to transform all of society into this better place that has less division and harm to other people, but rather to eliminate all the people who you don't like, because they're not going to change. That's not what the human does. As a species, we don't do that. Not quickly. Not in your lifetime, right? And so if you don't want them to be this negative weight on what you perceive to be our journey to a utopia, the only thing you could possibly be thinking is you want to eliminate them. So if you say, no, that's not what I'm thinking, then again, all you've really shown to me is your lack of a plan, because you're not trying to think of a way that we get everybody moving forward, because you're insulting these people. So it's like we need to have a plan that we're trying to move forward towards. And again, depends on who you're asking to construct, to make up the plan, is what, whether or not the plan has merit or is broad enough. But it feels as if with this group, because it does come from what it seems like a pretty strong political angle, and one that is dismissive to its opponents or to those who do not see it. Now, to defend the author just a second, whose name I just totally forgot, Hannah, her last name, Hannah Jones, right, I was right. To defend her, I don't know that that's what she thinks. She may, A, have a very workable solution, and B, and in fact, if you read some of the interviews that she did in late 20 and into early 21, she's moderated her position a little bit. She's recognized that perhaps some of the way she wrote the initial essay lacked some nuance. So at least there's some evidence that she's being thoughtful about it, to her credit. But the larger group behind it, you for myself, I come away thinking, I don't think that you guys really do want all of us moving forward together. Right.
So it would be almost, I think, necessary for Hannah to step up and go, look, that's, and speak about that. These are the nuances that I left out that we need to address, that we, because I don't think anybody who isn't a racist has a problem with critical race theory being taught in the schools. I think they're concerned how it's taught, and and they have a right to be concerned, because if you're saying these things, which in some cases that's exactly what they're saying, and they're pushing this political narrative that they want to push, then it's wrong. It's wrong to teach it that way. You need to be honest in what you're teaching, completely honest. And if you're not willing to do that, then it shouldn't be taught.
Yeah. When your program is to stop the marginalizing of a certain group of people, and to get there, you have to marginalize a certain group of people. You have no moral or value-led platform to stand on. And within CRT, now I don't think that's what the 1619 project necessarily was saying, but certainly within the concept of CRT, that is precisely their plan, as stated. The only way is to marginalize this group, that everyone is evil unless you are actively anti-racist and you're doing certain steps that they deem to be. I mean, it's really like a religion,
right?
Where the religion lays out, these are the indulgences you can get. If you do these certain things, you'll get a pass on this and this and this. I have the same criticism of the environmental movement,
right,
as it usually is expressed, as I do with these people, that they're not actually working towards real solutions, because there are some real solutions that could get us on moving in a good direction. And back to this group, you seem to miss you don't catch the illogical positions that you are taking in your own argument, and in some cases, specifically with CRT, that are harmful, hateful, separating, discriminatory.
Well, I agree, and you hit it on the head when you said it's like a religion, because as in a religion, you're not allowed to argue.
Right.
The
There's
point.
no questioning.
There's no
Right.
questioning. You have to accept it 100% fully, and that's not something I would be willing to do, and I don't think anyone should do. I don't think you should accept anything without being able to question it and have an honest and open dialogue. If you can't do that, right, I don't care what you bring to me. You could tell me everything that I love hearing, and I'm still going to tell you to get lost, because if I can't, and this is one of the things my friends get upset with, because I will take the opposite side of what I believe, because I want to see if what I believe holds water.
Right.
And so when they'll say something that they know that I would agree with, and then all of a sudden I'll start going at them at the opposite, and they get upset with me. They're like, "Why are you arguing with me? I'm saying something you like." And I said, because I want to see if what I believe is true,
right?
And if what you believe is true. If you can't, argue those points. If you can't argue your opponent's points, then you don't have a good enough understanding to be able to say this is the truth.
This is why I like you, Kurt, because you're a critical thinker. That's an aspect of critical thinking, that A, you hold your own opinions loosely, and B, you're willing to stand on the other side of the conversation, stand in their shoes, and examine why would they think, and you avoid the easy labels, because the easy labels don't really tell us anything. Because if you know humans, you know easy labels rarely are appropriate. Instead, there's something else in there that I want to be curious about, and a critical thinker is curious. So that's why I like hanging out with you.
Yeah, guys, he said, I'm a critical thinker.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you. I take that as a great compliment coming from you, so I really appreciate it. So with that being said, what's our solution? I mean...
Well, about which problem, though?
About the whole problem as all like CRT being taught in schools, about the 1619 project and the division that we see between people. What I see as the solution is for people like us to sit down and have an honest discussion and quit with the freaking agendas. Quit trying to push an agenda and quit listening to the people who they have an agenda, because, like you said, there's money there.
Yeah.
And because they're each going to give their own, slant on things, and we're never going to get the truth. So if we don't sit down and we don't have these discussions ourselves, you see this in the city halls, or where they're having these meetings about, where people show up and talk about CRT going into the schools. It's like, if you stand up against it, you automatically get called a racist. And that's their ploy. That's the ploy of every group now, is that if you go against them, they're going to call you every name they can. Because now what happens is you're no longer talking about the subject matter, you're too busy trying to defend yourself, going, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I'm not a homophobe, I'm not, because they've already attacked you. So you start defending yourself, and you lose track of what you're up there for, which is to say, that's why when someone calls me a racist or a homophobe, I'm like, I'm gay. If you think I'm a homophobe, more power to you. I don't care. But I'm not going to talk about what you think your opinion is of me. I'm going to speak the truth. And if the truth hurts you, you have a problem with the truth, not me.
Yeah.
So, and again, I don't think we can get the full truth until we can see it from all perspectives, and we can argue it from all perspectives.
Yeah.
So,
well, for myself, I think I'm willing to concede that it's going to take longer than people are going to be happy with. And it taking longer is just that the continued march to better, right? So you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think it's better to be a gay man in the year 2021 than in the year 1971.
Absolutely.
And certainly better to be a gay man than the year 1921. So it's a long process. What I think a perfect scenario would look like probably won't happen in my lifetime. I think also for me the solution is, and we've had this conversation before also, is to acknowledge that there's really what's going on is a spiritual, an internal question that involves the species, the individual members of the species. And so that connects me to probably the third point, which is to say to not expect something from a member of the species that is not possible to do or not likely to do, or something that takes a tremendous amount of effort to get there to do. I always try to remind my students and anybody who listen to me what the United States set out to do and is doing in its multiculturalism is not done anywhere else on the planet, not in a free society. And you can look at, say, for instance, the Persian Empire and say, well, it was multicultural. It was, but the groups that were there and had some degrees of some freedoms within their certain geographical place were still under the dominion with no voting, no say-so, and some limitation on their rights of the Persians.
And would it be accurate to say they also assimilated to their culture?
A lot of them did. So when the Jews go back to Israel, there were several that stayed in Babylon, for instance, but in the lands of that area because they'd grown comfortable to that, and they became more in that culture than of their own individual culture to begin with.
What I was asking is that groups that are conquered, groups that are taken over, and if they're not enslaved, they're just allowed to exist. They're expected to assimilate to the culture that took them over. To the, if, for instance, if Rome came, if Romans came into Germany and took over Germany, then the people there were expected to start learning to speak Latin.
Yes.
So, and that's one of the things that again doesn't make sense to me. You come into this country, and then you don't think that you should have to assimilate to be part of this country. You want, it's like you want to keep your culture. So why did you leave where you came from?
Yeah. Well, that is a different aspect of the topic. I think the thing for me that I like to emphasize is for the critics, whoever they may be, about where the country is. And I certainly can be a critic on certain arenas about where the country is. But particularly in matters of race, at least should, and these 1619 Project, in my opinion, does not, at least should start with saying what these people were attempting was never done before, and in the year 2021 is still rarely being done. Because, as we've already said a couple of times, the human typically as a species is drawn to sameness. And it's easier to have a geographical entity in which we're all the same, largely, whether that's race or outlook or viewpoint. And what the Americans did, or the Europeans coming to North America did, said, well, what if we did that differently? And they started it with religion, where they said, yes, everybody's a Christian, but you can have the varieties of Christianity. It wasn't done anywhere else on the planet. They expanded it to culture. So we're going to have some Dutch people, some Swedes, eventually some Spanish, some French. It's slow at first, but it begins to build. And I know for some of your listeners are like, oh, yeah, well, those are all white people. Not in the minds of the people in the 1770s. They weren't all white people. They were Swedes, they were Dutch, they were Germans, and they saw them in differing layers, right? At least until assimilation had begun to take second, third generation. And the Americans were trying to do something that, I mean, is it's flabbergasting in one sense. I mean, it's the kind of thing you go back in a jet plane or you go back in a time travel machine, and you want to go to John Adams and those guys and go, y'all need to pick a different topic. Because what you're trying to do is impossible. That will never work. It's never been that way. It will never work. And instead they look and they go, we're going to give it a shot. And so even though we've made halting progress, even though there's still times where women are discriminated against in this country, so they're not, I don't believe, not getting equal pay, but they certainly are not always allowed the same opportunities.
Right.
When you still see certain groups marginalized, I would say almost always not with law, but as you were saying, perhaps not protected by law, you still go, but look at what they're trying. I would suggest any of your listeners, you hop on a plane and you fly to any other capital in the world, including places like Canada and Australia, and you're going to get off the plane and you're going to see 90 to 95% identical race, identical ethnicity. So in the year 2021, we're this one spot. Now, there are a couple other countries like Canada and Australia where they're working to get there. But we're this one spot on the planet that says we're going to try to do a civic entity with a myriad of cultural groups, and we're going to try to work together to make it happen. That we don't do it well, and that at times that there's violence or conflict, the question ought to be, the praise ought to be, it only happens as infrequently as it does. Even though I notice some of the people listening, they would say it happens far too much. It's like, I'm with you, but actually, if you look at it, it's far less than one would imagine when you consider what we're trying to accomplish. And when you look at other, the world's a mess right now. I don't know if your listeners are paying attention, but there are mass riots, protests, conflict, and in some places, warfare, people group to people group. And at least for now, that's still not happening in our country. And so we're trying to do this magical mystery tour, and it's not perfect, but my goodness, I would not want to live anywhere else.
I agree. And that's the thing and again, you make another great point, is that living in a country where it's a homogeneous country, they have it's such a difficult thing for even people who are, like 95% the same race. We live in this heterogeneous country, and of course it's going to be much harder to make this work. But but like you said, to our credit, we're doing, I think, a pretty damn good job. I think the problem with this is again, we talk about where I call the extremists on both sides. We have one side over here that says this country sucks. It hasn't made any progress, and it's evil and it's corrupt. And then we have on this side, America's the greatest. We ain't done nothing wrong.
Butterflies and unicorns.
Exactly. And it's like, and both of you are full of shit.
Yeah.
And that's not, and you're being disingenuous unless you're just completely stupid and don't know any better. I mean, honestly, but the rest of us, we need to just shut those voices out and go, they don't speak for, look, when I tell people, I go, that person you just heard, they don't speak for my side. And I need to also say, that person I just heard over there, they don't speak for their side either, because I know people on their side and they're not like that. They're not those type of people who believe that kind of BS.
Yep.
So, but we tend to fall into this, my side is right. And so we listen to people like Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow, and they're all full of shit. They're all of them. They're all grifters. They're saying what they know that their base wants to hear, and they're making money. They're banking. They're banking
money
off of our stupidity. And to me, these people are traitors of this country.
Wow. Okay.
Because when you're willing to sell out, and what the effect that you have on the people who listen to you, and you're being you're bullshitting them, and you don't care because you're banking on that, you're a traitor.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
I don't have anything, like, I'm not even going to sugarcoat. That's why I consider you a traitor. You deliberately are harming this country, and you don't give a damn.
Yeah.
So that was an intense.
That's okay. That's good.
It is, because people need to hear this, and I hope they listen. I hope they get out of this that You just need to start challenging the things that you're hearing, regardless of whether it's your side or not. You need to challenge everything. And I tell people that all the time. You don't believe me. Don't believe Carl. Like what Carl said, research it yourself.
Yep.
Go find out for yourself, and then that way you'll know, and you won't. Because
the 1619 thing about indentured servants.
Right, exactly.
Go find out about that, because the idea of what we consider slavery, which is I'm born into it, the child is born into it, that doesn't start till 1660, 1680. Virginia begins changing the laws, largely because they were saying it was a little challenging to try to keep a new influx of new people.
Well,
and
that's
it's a lot easier just to take the child.
Well, that's what I understood, is that it was so shitty to be an indentured servant over here that people's like, okay, we're not going to do that. But
remember, you lost indentured servants. Right? So, again, back to criticism of 1619, even by the 1650s, you have a very small, but you already have free blacks living in the society. They weren't banished. They weren't somehow kicked out of the country. They weren't hated on. Some of them became economically very successful. Some of them became slave owners.
Yes, and you're absolutely right.
So,
there were Indian slave owners. There were black slave owners.
They didn't leave the society. If it was as hateful and as ugly as is portrayed, then you would imagine the moment somebody got free, they would have left, but they stayed. Now, again, they do change the law by 1660, 1670, and, so anyway, that's back to the point you were making as far as just listening and challenging. Feel free. Please go Google it. Go look it up and see what happened in 1619 and what the differences were between indentured servants. It's not great. Neither one of us want to be an indentured servant or a slave, so we're not suggesting that it was wonderful or easy or comfortable. But there is a difference between the two, and the 1619 Project, I think, fails to really bring that out.
Well, I don't know how I should say this because I don't want to take credit for it, but how many Africans come over to America, to the U.S. every year?
It's a large percentage. I wouldn't have a number, but I do know that it's in the tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands, who migrate here every year from Africa intentionally.
So what does that tell us?
It's not as bad as we're told if you're a black person. And these people are not, you could say, well, they don't know. Some of them that might be true about. But then for most of them, don't you think they would get on a plane and get on a boat and get the hell out? They would say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize, I thought America was the land of the free, and I got here because I'm black. It's horrible. I'm maligned and I'm put over here. So I'm going to go home. And nobody would stop them. I mean, I tell my students that all the time. If you think it's that bad, I will happily pay for you to denounce your citizenship, and I'll pay for your flight wherever you want to go, anywhere you want to go in the world. Funny how nobody ever really wants to take you up on that.
I do.
So
I'll go to Switzerland.
Well, I'll buy your plane ticket.
Only because that's where I want to retire.
Yeah. But so there's a large percentage. There's a large percentage that come. A large number, I shouldn't say percentage. There's a large number, more than one would imagine, if it was as bad as everybody says it is, for particularly to be a black person.
Right. Well, I'm not saying it's because it's bad here. It's just I figured, well, if you're going to give me a ticket to go to Switzerland, I'll go. Because it's such a beautiful place.
It is beautiful.
It's expensive, though.
But again, so the last time I looked up this data was, I think, 2012, somewhere in that ballpark. So it may have, I'm sure it's changed a little bit. But when I looked that up using UN statistics, more people immigrated free will to the United States than every other country combined. Right? So again, we're not talking about a world that's in North Korea, they're in a news blackout, right? So China may not know the whole story, but most of the world, including the third world, where cell phones have now made a very serious dent. A lot of people, it's a lot of opportunity for people, which is great to have their own, by having some data connection to the internet, right? They know what the United States is like. So it's not like if it was as horrible as everybody said, you would imagine after 2019 or 2020 that nobody would move here, that we'd be having a drain of people, and nobody would be marching up from Honduras and Colombia through Mexico. They would all be going, why would I go there? It's the worst place possible. Right.
Well, I don't think that they would say that. I think especially in the third world countries that even if they thought the U.S. was horrible, it's nowhere near as horrible as where they live. So, I
guess. I just feel like the immigration statistics is a piece of evidence in the defining, how do we write the definition of, like, say, what we think things are like right now and where we're trying to go to. If you're saying I want to go to a better place, but you can't define where you are or the better place,
right,
then you're not really helpful. So you got to be able to say, oh, look, here's all this evidence of bad or good or whatever. And I think the Ledger is so totally on the side of it's amazing. And again,
right.
My point being, you don't see most people, some do, but you don't see most people denouncing their citizenship and moving out of here. You don't see them.
Right.
You don't see them going, well, I don't want to leave because I like America, but I'm going to only live in a society, a place with only people like me. We're going to go buy 100,000 acres in Utah or someplace and create our own city that we can make perfect. And by the way, historically, when you look at utopian movements, because that's what that would be, they're always bad. They always end horribly for everybody, right? So and I'm already picked on environmentalists more than once today, but I just get really frustrated with people who want to bash X thing or bash the country, and yet they don't, with their own lives, live out their own convictions. You know I'm a Christian,
right?
I get really annoyed with people who claim the name of Christ, who refuse to do the things that he says, usually because it's going to cost them, right? And while I'm not perfect, I have tried desperately for all of my life as living as a Christian. I've been a Christian literally my entire life, to follow at my own cost. And I won't bore you with the breakdown of that, of what it means. So if I'm going to be an environmentalist, never fly on a plane again. Don't give me this carbon credit thing that you're going to claim down. Be somebody who has the integrity to stand. And I get really frustrated when it's like, back to this topic. Yeah, I'm mad about the country. Well, then either work to fix it and have a very clear thing you're trying to fix, or, move somewhere else. I mean, you can move a lot of places. And no.
Right. No, and let me, so I'm going to make 2 points. One, you're absolutely right. For instance, I'll take the Philippines. The Philippines, they have an opportunity to go to Australia, which very much is like our society, but they don't. That's not they don't want to go there. They'll go there if they have to, but they want to be here. And I think that's the case with most people who come from third world countries. They want to be here because they know this is the land of opportunity. If you can make it here easier than you can make it anywhere else if you're willing to do the work. So I completely agree with you. Now, I want to touch on the environmental thing, because I think it's a false equivalency when you say, oh, well, do you drive a car? Do you I don't think you can say, because I drive a car and I put 130 miles on my car a week, that's somehow comparable to, Exxon dumping.
It's not comparable, but what could that person do instead?
Well, and that's the thing. It's like I think most people who consider themselves environmentalists, we do make different steps. Like, for instance, the amount of, to say their carbon footprint, the amount of garbage, whether, like, if I go to a grocery store, and I take my canvas bags rather than plastic bags and let them bag that up, those are all little steps, and they all help. But I
just know most people don't. And one of my best friends is a hardcore environmentalist. He drives electric cars only. He's got solar on his house. He doesn't use any regular, combustion engine type stuff. I have so much respect for him.
Right.
We don't agree about on some of the issues, but he's very thoughtful and very moderate. But he's earned that by taking the time to say, this is the way I'm going to live, and to prove that. And I just find others don't do that.
Well, and again, I fell into this trap a long time ago where, I would have a very, hard line with people, and I realized that sometimes people only do what they can. Like, for instance, I would love to drive a Tesla. I would love to drive an electric car. Right now, I can't afford one. But if I could, I would certainly drive an electric car. I would have solar panels on my home. But all these things cost a great deal of money. And so for a lot of people, it's not an option. It's not that they wouldn't do it. They just don't have the option to do it. So I try not to drive such a hard line with those people. But if they're not doing anything, like you said, they're just still their garbage can is full to the brim every week because they don't recycle or they don't do any of those things, and yet you're gonna rail against big oil companies or whatever, then you're absolutely right. Then you have no right to be speaking up about anything. So, well, like I said, this was. Again, I always love our conversations.
Me too, Kurt. Me too, buddy. Thank you, sir.
Well, it's my pleasure. All right, folks. I hope you're not as drained as I am after that. But I hope you did I hope you listen to what we had to say. I hope you do your own research and come to your own conclusions, and just keep an open mind about things, and look at things from different perspectives so that you can get more of the truth instead of a partial truth, which is just, because you only look at it from one viewpoint. So anyway, thank you again, Carl. And folks, thank you for joining us. And until next time, be safe, take care. See you later.